Hello everybody, and this is Ursula and Anne from, we are the co-founders of BEabove Leadership, and we are wrapping up our conversation series on the neuroscience consciousness and what might be an awkward conversation in regards to the racial divide in America. Hello, Anne.
Hi, Ursula. It's great.
Here we are. Yes, here we are.
It's been fun kind of looking at the diversity of people that we've interviewed this week. So I think that what Ursula and I want to talk about is the thing that we're actually qualified to talk about, which is what's primarily, what's going on in the brain that has people respond to things, in this case, race and racism and the potentially awkward conversation from different levels of effectiveness. Because that's been what we've been fascinated by for almost, 15 to 20 years. But before we talk about the different aspects of what's going on in the brain, let's just talk a little bit about why did we want to do this series? What was our motivation behind doing the series?
Well, one of our motivations was that we wanted to make a contribution from the place of where we could make a contribution from, which you just mentioned, which is neuroscience and consciousness, and shedding a light through our expertise on this conversation. And you and I talked about it, and I certainly have to say that I know next to nothing. I'm not an expert. I am just a human being in this conversation. So I think it was important for us to focus on neuroscience and consciousness.
Yeah, and to say, to bring in a variety of people who had their own take on things, because I think as we were looking at, you and I had some conversations, well, what is the conversation around racism from various points on the 7 levels? We have our perspective, but that might be very different than the perspective of Eric, who grew up in the Deep South, of Tom, who worked in an inner city congregation, of Keisha, who'd been in the corporate world, et cetera, et cetera. So I think part of it was really recognizing we're not the only ones who should be having the conversation. So that was part of it. But the part that I'd love to deepen with you today, Ursula, is to talk a little more about this fascination we have of what's happening in the brain that makes certain things possible or impossible.
Yeah, and what I really love about this conversation, I really see how important that is in regards to this topic. But I also know that it is important about any topic and any conversation, particularly when it is awkward or could be potentially awkward. And I know in my life, there are plenty of opportunities to have those conversations, no matter what the topic is.
Yeah, and I think about, as we move in consciousness, it's almost like our filter changes. This isn't, the angels are not singing with that one. That may be very obvious, forgive me. But these are sort of 7 different filters through which we can look at the world. But we also know, and what at BEabove we've really been fascinated by is, well, what makes that filter change? And I was thinking about when you're at the eye doctor, you were just at the eye doctor and they click in the, what makes that filter change from looking at everything as a threat, which would be more in what we lovingly call the below the line levels of hopelessness, fear, and frustration, where the world appears like a threat, up through, courage, engagement, innovation, and synchronicity, where the brain becomes more and more able to take in complex information, competing information, paradoxical, multiple perspectives. That really grows as we increase in consciousness.
Yeah, I agree. It's also interesting that this conversation right now is also happening during COVID. And so I am also wondering, and certainly we know that the impact of other stressors, like, for example, COVID, really takes a toll on the brain. And then you layer that other piece on. I think our brains then right from the start are not as effective as they maybe are during what I now call other normal times.
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting, and I don't have the research on this in terms of COVID, and I'm sort of a little reluctant just to speak from my own experience because it's very limited. but there was sort of two, I think on the one hand, for many people who were already feeling very stressed, very reactive, probably struggle more with some of the lower levels anyway, you know, they may have reacted to some of the things that were happening in the world, really that kind of blew up because of George Floyd's murder. You know, they reacted in ways that were very damaging and nasty and mean. And I think what you're saying is that it could have been that this was was sort of seen as an additional stress load, and they may have been more able to self-regulate in more normal times.
Yes.
So on the one hand, I think we had that. On the other hand, what I thought was really interesting is that somebody said to me, why is this getting more attention now? Or I said that to somebody, I can't remember because this was not my analysis, but I thought it was really good. Part of it was, well, because people are home and they have time to pay attention. So I think there was also a certain group of people who had some stress because of COVID, but also maybe had less stress, less demand, and their brains were more able to actually not filter this out as being irrelevant, but make it more relevant. And those were probably people who tend to live a little more up here. And so the day-to-day demands of just like work and all of that weren't pressing on them in quite the same way. Does that make sense, Ursula?
Yeah, that makes total sense because, you know, I'm not even thinking about sort of the more below the line stresses and demands like deadlines and work and travel. But I'm also thinking about the above the line distractions that we used to have, you know, vacations and movie times and dates and dating. And I mean, I don't know what else. You know, driving kids to sports, etc. So I think we've all been living with a fair amount of also above the line distractions, where some of these important conversations, they sort of shift downwards. You know, there's so many other things that take our priority, and then some other conversations sort of shift into the background. So it makes total sense.
Right. And so this became more of a front of mind awareness just because we weren't getting, I mean, just on the really practical level, we weren't busy getting ready to go to the movies.
Yes.
So that's an interesting, sort of an interesting thing in this time. The other thing so one of the things we say about the brain is that, and we'll talk a little more about this, but disintegration increases below the line, and that's that expanding triangle in that direction. And integration increases above the line. We get more balanced in terms of who we are, less tipped into what we might call reaction or a narrow way of looking. And one of the things that I want to lean into a little bit with you is the idea of how does empathy become more integrated above the line. So, because I think that's a very, very key thing that's happening here.
Yeah, I agree. It's really been interesting because, as you say, everything increases, you know, the more above the line we go. And that has a lot to do with brain integration, including empathy. And one of the things that really sort of struck me is the ability to, number one, slow down, and the ability to listen and be curious. Really, I think there is a link. If we can slow down and be connected to the other human being, put our own opinions aside and deeply listen, that is really something that fits into the higher levels of the effectiveness model. And we do need a calmer brain in order to do that.
A more regulated brain, a brain that has some sort of, I think about checks and balances, and that, you know, it's like, if you've ever seen an outrigger canoe?
Yes, I have. Yep.
I think of that as an above the line brain. And the whole point of the outrigger, that it's to balance the canoe, and it keeps the canoe from tipping over in rocky seas. And so you end up with this, if you start going too far, you know, you start going too far in this direction, you end up with a balance, or you start going too far in the direction of some of the areas of the brain that are more associated with fear and threat. You start going too far in that direction. The brain, as we go higher in the levels, has that kind of outrigger where it'll kind of check you. And
Yes.
we, develop, you sort of, well, hold on a minute, is that just my perception? Is that true? Those kind of questions, they serve to help to keep us from tipping over. And this is beneficial in every area. This, there's nothing specific about this in terms of the racial divide and racism and all of that. It's true in every area. It's just particularly, we're just looking at it through this lens. But we all need that kind of outrigger balance, because if we tip too far in any direction, we end up doing things that we're not proud of, happy about, and sometimes that are really destructive to others and ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. What you're also speaking to, sort of what I am seeing in others, as well as certainly in my own brain, is that when that tipping happens, and I really lose some of my, the smart part of my
Right.
brain, sort of not quite awake yet and not functioning quite as well. Part of that aspect of that smart brain is empathy, but it also, I think, is looking at a topic and a conversation and a human being that is clearer rather than distorted by my own frustration and fear, and by the chemicals that have an impact on that part of the brain.
Yeah, so you can look, so one of the things that starts happening either, and I think this can be, there's a couple of ways we can look at it. One is in a brain that has had less practice being in balance, or in a brain that is overloaded by stress. One of the aspects of that, and the research is really good on this, if you look at the research on the prefrontal cortex, when we talk about the smart brain, it's going to play a major role in being able to assess and make decisions and all of that. But one of the other things is that if that part of the brain is under regulated or overstressed, what ends up happening is everything becomes, excuse the words, black and white.
Yes.
And it's the ability to see people as, we want to put people into categories. We want to put them into boxes. What we want to do at the most basic level, this is no excuse, but at the most basic levels, we want to conserve energy.
Yes.
And if I can categorize you, I can conserve energy. I don't
Yeah.
have to think about, well, you're German. What kind of German are you? I can just decide you're German and then just interact with you in a certain way, right?
Slap the label right on there,
and we're done.
Good,
I don't have to think anymore, right? Right.
That's actually a really a good point. I've never actually thought about it from that perspective, that it is easier for the brain. Now, the other thing that I find really interesting is this whole concept of walking our talk on a daily basis before a crisis happens. So, when my clients, want to make changes, and some of it is sort of big, monumental, I always say to them, start somewhere where it's less intimidating. Start in an area of your life where you're already almost good. You're good there, and experiment there, so that when something big happens, you are better prepared. It's a little bit like working out in the gym. You can't just go and lift 50 pounds. You have to start with 2 pounds. And I think for our brains, as it relates to any kind of difficult topic, that is true, is do the work on a daily basis, so you get that wiring in, so that when something bad or really important happens, you're somewhat prepared and your brain is prepared.
That's really cool. I think that's really interesting. And I think this is part of why it's, doing things like, and one of the things, so speaking of awkward, this is where I feel awkward. Okay, because I wish I could do the right meme, but I saw this meme, which was sort of like, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But none of it is the answer. And if somebody has the answer, of what I should be doing about as a white person right now. Just, there's lots of advice out there. Okay. But there's this way of saying all of it might contribute. And so doing things like reading fiction by authors of color, indigenous people, people like that, reading that kind of fiction, especially at a time when you're not stressed about it, can help bring in those perspectives and wire them in as legitimate perspectives. Reading more history, all of those things can wire in a more expansive view in your brain. And so, no, it's not the answer. And having a book club may not be the only or the right thing to do. I don't know. But I also don't think that, I think our view at BEabove is any movement of love, which is ultimately above the line, is not wasted.
Yeah.
It's not wasted.
Yeah, it's a little bit, the metaphor that comes to me is, if you want to make a really good soup, it takes more than just, onions and rice. It takes many ingredients that makes that soup really delicious. And I think in regards to whether it's consciousness or this conversation, it takes many different pieces to make that come together.
Yeah, and I think the soup is a really good metaphor, because at the same time we want to check ourselves that we're not putting spoiled meat or spoiled vegetables or toxic shit into that soup. Yeah. And that's, so it's like calling out, hold on, was what I just said or did, was that actually a toxic part of the soup? Or was it, maybe not the main meat we're going to eat, but it was a little bit of spice along the way. So I think I love that metaphor. We keep circling around this thing called empathy. So I want to say more about it, because I think you and I have come to see, speaking of doing things beforehand, this has been a major focus of ours for the end of 2018 or the end of 2019 and 2020 has been this: what is empathy? What is goodness? What is evil? What is this? And we have become huge fans of a researcher named Simon Baron-Cohen. And he basically has discovered through brain scan technology and working with a variety of people, including psychopaths, that there are at least 10 different brain areas associated with empathy. So it isn't just one thing, and it's not just this, in terms of goodness, we might say empathy is not just one ingredient in the soup. Mm-hmm. Pot that holds the soup. It's the thing that makes it possible to have soup. And I think sometimes the way that we've come to think about it in human development is now have a little empathy. It's like, yes. Right? Like now bring in put the little spice of empathy on there. Like, but what's your pot? What's holding it, holding the whole thing? It is whether you have empathy or not. And the more, what we could see is the more you go above the line, you move from having very little empathy to having increasing amounts of empathy, but also knowing how to regulate it. Mm-hmm. So part of the integration of empathy is both what the body is sensing, the felt empathy, mm-hmm. as well as the cognitive empathy, and having an integration there is really critical. So that's part of what I think we're seeing when people can act in these ways that are basically doing torture, murdering. We are looking, and I don't mean this in a light way at all, we are looking at someone who has very little areas in their brain firing of empathy. They are disrupted in terms of their different parts of the brain and empathy.
So I'm curious about something. This might put you on the spot, and if it does, I apologize. Okay. So for like a neurotypical brain like mine, are there ways that I can develop more empathy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I want to say a couple of things about that. One is the more you can put yourself in someone else's shoes, and we know one of our favorite things in neuroscience is just the basic idea of neuroplasticity, that the more you wire, the more you think or do or imagine a certain thing, the more wiring you get in that area, the more practice you get. So, practicing this is where I come back to, it's not the only thing, but if all you could do is start reading books by people of color that talk authentically about their own experience, that fiction, if it's well written, will put you in that person's shoes. It's why you start to cry or you feel scared if it's well done. Sometimes, well done movies can do the same thing, and that can help you pattern that kind of understanding of another person's reality. One thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, without going into the details of the interview, but I remember one of my interviewees sharing a story, and it really opened my eyes to the struggle of living in fear as it relates to law enforcement that I had never thought about. And it's interesting, as I was driving to my daughter's house yesterday, there's one stretch on the highway where the police always hangs out under the bridge to, get the people to speed. And it was funny, I was driving by there and I was thinking, this is such a different experience for me because I drive within the speed limit, so I don't have to be afraid. But this was Eric, and for Eric, he can drive within the speed limit and still be afraid. And it's really raised my level of awareness of going, wow, just seeing the car there can create a fear response from somebody that has certain experiences in regards to that.
Yeah, and I think when it's the and what I want to say about this, I want to be thoughtful about how I say it, because we have been presented that being white is the default or the dominant culture, and worldwide it's not. And I'm not even sure what the numbers are in America. I probably should know, but it's sort of this, it's like this default. And so even in the last 20 years, if you look at sitcoms and movies and things like that, we are starting to see more representation, I was doing a project 4 or 5 years ago, and I was really looking for people of color in clip art. And it was really hard to find people doing what I needed them to be doing for this project that I was working on. And I'm finding it easier now. So there's some kind of something shifting in terms of that. But there is this, when I think about when we've had, for me, 50 odd years of just assuming that my way is the way it is, and everybody must just feel this way because that's how I feel when I drive down the road. We have to make more effort to bring in those other experiences and have it be, more than just one conversation, more than just one movie we watch, but keep ourselves open to what is this experience from someone who doesn't have the same context as I do.
Yeah, I agree. I think this was one of the things that I immensely enjoyed about our series is being able to get a glimpse into these lives and into those perspectives and how different they were and how illuminating it was. 6 different viewpoints.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've heard people say, and I can both relate to, and I also want to say, well, suck it up, Buttercup. And I'm saying that to myself as well, is that sort of staying open and staying curious, and that, curiosity really increases the more we go above the line. The brain stops being as committed to its sort of comfortable pathways.
Yes.
But sort of, people saying, man, I'm getting tired. And and I've heard some people say, if it's tiring for you as a white person talking about it, imagine what it is living it. And that's where I say to myself, yeah, if you're tired of the effort of really walking in the shoes of someone whose shoes you don't usually walk in, imagine what it's like to live that, and suck it up, Buttercup. And that's, like I said, what I'm saying to myself. Because I've had those thoughts, those unbidden thoughts. It's like, oh my gosh, another petition about a Black person who was killed in America, and another petition to get the case reopened so that it gets addressed as a murder. And I'm like, oh my God, another one. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, you know what? Suck it up.
Yeah.
Stay present to it. Keep your brain open to that. so that you can continue to feel that.
You know, you just said a really interesting word, which is keep staying, being present. And that is also something that increases the more above the line we go, the more our brains get integrated. We develop a greater capacity to be present, and also to be present to being uncomfortable, and to be present that it's awkward. So that also increases, you know, on the higher levels.
Yeah, and one of the reasons is sort of to come back to kind of the brain, you know, what we think is going on is one of the things that that we think happens is that we develop this better and better capacity to be in what we would call observer mind. It's not that you don't have the experience here. It's not that you never feel hopeless or afraid or frustrated, but that what starts happening and becomes more available, we believe, in the higher levels in terms of what's going on in brain balance and integration, is that you can be curious about your own experience. You can be present to it. You can say, you know, this happened to me yesterday. I saw another petition for a young Black man who was killed, and you know, there was a part of me that went, oh my God, when can I stop sharing these petitions?
Yes.
You know, like hopeless.
Yeah.
And also a little entitled.
Yeah.
And then observing that and saying, okay, that's how you feel. Now what? Rather than that's how I feel, therefore it's true.
Yeah.
Therefore it's real. And that's what happens, I think, at the lower levels, is whatever you're feeling is the truth. Rather than it's just a feeling, it's just a thought, it's maybe it may be an unbidden thought. It may be a thought that's coming in from your, you know, dad, who knows?
Yeah. And it's, and I think when we are in this more observer mind, we can really use the information from those uncomfortable places that give us such great a heads up of, you know, if I can be curious about my anxiety and my frustration as it relates to this, it really leads me into a different arena of investigating and finding out, well, what is behind that. And I think that is another really such an important point about the 7 levels, is saying, okay, that's information and I need to pay attention to that.
It's information. Is it true? Is it not true? Yeah. What do I do with that? Is that something I need to kind of excavate in myself? Or is it, you know, where does it fit in all of here? And, you know, if we think about what's happening so much at the lower levels, is we're trying to stay safe. Yeah. From our perception of what safety is. And often it's a very wrong perception. Yeah. Because of culture, because of context, because of what the media has told us, et cetera, et cetera. But that's what our brain is tapping into. And the more we go above the line, the more the brain becomes able, because of this observer quality and what you're saying, to be curious about the information. And to look at it without getting awash in anger or shame or fear that are going to keep us from staying present. And so I'm just thinking about one of the definitions of this very high field, the field of innovation, is the ability to set aside ego.
And personal agendas.
Yeah, doesn't mean you don't have it. Mm-hmm. But can I, and I'm, you know, thinking about examples that I've seen people share of where they have been told that something they did or said was racist, and they've set aside their ego and they've said, tell me more, or God, I'm really sorry, and I will not do that again.
Yeah. And, you know, we started this conversation by saying, you know, what we're sharing today, you know, our strength, our expertise is about neuroscience, consciousness, and coaching. So just this example, you know, if we could apply that to most of our conversations with anyone, I think we would have better relationships, and, certainly just from that curiosity and that non-personal agenda, we really could create a much better world.
Yeah, well, you have to, in order to actually really listen to someone else and listen to their experience, listen to what they want to say, you have to be in this place where you're not running it through a threat filter.
Yes.
Where
Yep.
you're running it through a collaboration filter, where you're running it through this, how do we make a better world together filter? And, your brain needs to be both in a certain calm state in terms of stress, but also, this goes back to what you said, like, do the work in advance, be working on your own general response to threat. And when you get angry or afraid out of nowhere, be working to heal that, do the work to heal that, because that has implications everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great preparation for whatever might come at us, both on a global as well as a personal level.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just wondering if you have any, we're talking very generally, one of the things that I have said for many years is the 7 levels. And there's a link in this video, and on our channel, there's a general video about the 7 levels if you want to learn more about them. But, one of the things we like to say is they are deceptively simple and endlessly complex. And we do get people, from time to time who, and I think it's very sweet, who are sort of like, oh, I'm just living in synchronicity. And we just think, wow, you're practically a saint, because I sure don't. Because it's a lot of bloody work to get your brain in a state that you can actually hold curiosity and openness, but also not just because somebody said it, it's therefore true, but to be an observer of everything. That's a pretty well-regulated, well-developed, well-integrated brain that I think takes a lot of work to get there.
It takes a lot of work. I'm thinking about, both setting aside personal agendas and ego when, somebody has something to say to me that I might not want to hear or is hard to hear. That's one thing. But I think there also, talk about brain integration. I also need to have a certain amount of boundaries with myself and other people, that not everything is okay. Not everything is a go ahead.
Right.
I think I find that an interesting, sort of push pull that I feel, in some relationships that I have, and in other relationships, it is completely natural. When I think about our relationship, and we've known each other for almost 20 years. Talk about being in the gym of a relationship. Talk about, heavy lifting. We have done that. And so, I think that is the other thing that fits in here. When we have a long trusting relationship with someone, I think that's the place where we can actually test out our strength of how empathetic we are and how curious we are. Much harder to do with relationships that are already a little unsteady.
Yeah, and I think about years ago, and this might sound a little simplistic, so forgive me, and I also can't remember the names, but when I was a philosophy student, which was 30 years ago, I read this article, and it's, I read so much that didn't stay with me, but I was studying feminist philosophy at the time, and there was an article written by a white woman and a Chicana woman, a Latina.
Yeah.
And they were talking about their views. So this is 30 years ago. And the article was entitled Crossing the Bridge of Friendship. Because what they came to in this philosophical article was that the best answer that they could find really was to authentically cross the bridge of friendship, to really, really actually know the other person as a person.
Yes.
As a person, this walk really in their shoes, not walk in the shoes of a type of people, but walk in the particular shoes of this person.
In this individual.
Yeah, this individual, this, you know, and this is something that came up in, you know, my interviews, and I know other people have said this too. And, you know, I think it was Keisha that I was interviewing, is like, look, I am not a Black woman, I'm Keisha, you know, that's part of my identity, but, you know, like, look, we're not all the same. And, you know, don't put us in that lump there. And that's part of what you do with a friend, right?
Yeah.
With a real friend is, it's
Yeah.
like, well, who are you?
Yeah.
Who are
Yeah.
you really? And,
I love that. I love that. I think this might be a good last thought on closing, is saying, you know, don't lump people into a category, but really cross that bridge of friendship and get to know that individual, because every individual has a different history, has a different context, has a different worldview. And, you know, I'm German. You ask the next German next to me, that's a different German from me German.
German. Yeah, and it's gonna, you know, it's gonna take more, as I said at the beginning, it's easier to put people in a category because you don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
And that takes thought and energy, but it's worthwhile energy. And I was thinking about, why did we pick the people that we picked? Because we picked the people that we picked, and there was this theme with all of them. And the theme that I would point to, and Ursula, you might have a different take, but of all of the folks we interviewed, there was this grace about them. And one of the reasons that we picked them is they all had particular experiences, whether it was from law enforcement, whether it was growing up with a brown skin, but they all, as important or more important, is they're all working on their own development. And they use the model of the 7 levels because they like that, but they're all working to be more integrated humans. And there was just this like overarching theme of, these are people who walk in the world gracefully, every one of them.
I agree. And there's just a little add-on. I certainly heard from my people the deep commitment to continue to learn, the deep commitment to be an observer, the deep commitment to check out their own biases, their own fears, the deep commitment to look at, you know, any subject, but particularly this one, from this perspective of, I have a perspective, but it is not everything. So I want to learn more. So that deep commitment really was just amazing to see.
Yeah, you know, we first came into this work, I think, me and Ursula, and I think what keeps me going and draws me back is that I can't fix everything that pains me in this world, or that pains anybody in this world. I can't fix much of anything, actually. But if there's a linchpin to it all, if there's an access point to it all, it's consciousness.
Yes.
And being able to say there are certain things happening in the brain, and the more that we understand that, the more that we do, the more that we may know how to help.
Yeah.
Get people to higher levels where they can have more awkward conversations that are hopefully connective and productive.
Yeah, and help people self-regulate, self-regulate their brains so that they can be less below the line in those, fear and frustration and hopelessness places, and more in courage and above.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for watching. Thank you for participating with the series. Thank you for letting us be just awkward about it and put our toe in the water in something we don't know very much about. And Ursula, thank you for all of your beautiful wisdom and leadership.
Thank you. Thank you too. So thanks everybody. Take care.